WeedSmart's an industry-led initiative where a group of herbicide companies and seed companies and GRDC put some money together to create a consistent message about managing herbicide-resistant weeds and also about the awareness of resistant weeds. And our topic for the day is about grazing chaff dumps, and very fortunate to be joined today by Andrew Boultbee, who is a grain grower at York with his wife Marjorie. So a little bit about grazing chaff dumps. It's an area where we have only minimal amount of science on the grazing of chaff dumps from a chaff cart, and Andrew's going to share some grower experience. Just a little bit about harvest weed seed control. We think this is crazy that at harvest time we just harvest through a crop that has weeds in it, and we spread those weed seeds out to give us something to spray next year. And so harvest weed seed control is taking off around the country, and it's great to see, and we believe it's our #1 non-herbicide tool for managing resistant weeds, because if we just harvest through and spread out the resistant weeds, we are rewarding the survivors, of course. We know now that with harvest weed seed control there's at least 5 commercially available options, and there's even a 6th one that growers have developed. So we have quite a few options out there, and next week we'll actually be featuring a webinar on the chaff deck for those that are interested. But this week we're talking about these things. We're talking about using the chaff cart. It's not new. The chaff cart's been around for a long time. We've seen a resurgence of them in Western Australia and a few starting to take off around the country. And today we're talking about using the chaff cart. Traditionally, this is what's been done with chaff dumps. We dump poles in the paddock and then we send them up in smoke. We burn that resource. Today we're talking about what is the potential of using these as grazing and doing away with that, with burning them. So first question is how much ryegrass seed does pass through the animal. If we graze the chaff dumps, do they just spread it all back around the paddock? And the research that I've found, and I'll show you some of that data in a moment, is that only a very small percentage, so 1 to 4% of the ryegrass seeds pass through the sheep rumen as viable seeds. And so while we may be spreading a little bit of ryegrass seed back onto the paddock, I always think that if we capture 75 or 80% of the ryegrass in the paddock, put it in the chaff dump, and then the sheep take 2 or 3% back out to the paddock, it's still a very effective harvest weed seed control tool. So the good news is if we graze them with sheep, we're only expecting a very small bypass through the rumen. Cattle, on the other hand, is a different story, and it depends which study you look at, but a lot more viable ryegrass seed survives passage through the rumen of cattle, so probably not a good idea to graze chaff dumps with cattle in the paddock. However, I do know of growers doing it, and obviously there is a compromise there. So just a little bit of the data on those studies about how much ryegrass seed survives the rumen. Graham, Shaw and Stern did one of the first studies back in 1977, and they found that less than 1% of the ryegrass survived passage through the rumen. Another study I found by Stanton and others in 2002 showed that about 3.9% of the ryegrass seed survived, and so as you can see, it depends which study you look at as to whether you think it's 1 or 3%. And that study also showed that in cattle, 11.9% of the ryegrass seed survived passage through the rumen. Another study I just found by, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Haida et al. In 2010 was a study on a lot of different weed seeds, and they used fistulated sheep where they put seeds of different species of weeds into the rumen of animals, and that study found that wild radish and ryegrass, all of the seeds were completely destroyed after 2 days in the rumen, whereas there were other species of weeds that were put into the rumen for 4 days and had 70 or 80% of weed seed survival in the rumen after 4 days. So there is a big difference between species. Some species are really well adapted to survive the passage through the rumen. Fortunately for us, it seems that our main weeds, ryegrass and wild radish, don't survive passage through the rumen terribly well. Now, this is one of my great regrets in life, that I didn't listen to Keith Devonish. Sorry, Keith, if you're listening. Keith and I were working in the Department of Ag in Geraldton back in the early, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and Keith did some trials where he looked at grazing chaff dumps back then and found some really good information, and I didn't listen, and I should have. What Keith did was he went to a farmer at Minganew who was using a chaff cart just like Andrew is, and they went to some wheat chaff dumps and grazed them with sheep and observed what happened. So they found that when the sheep grazed those chaff dumps, it reduced the volume of the chaff dump by about 1/3, but it spread the dump out. The area of the chaff dump is spread out to about 3-fold the size that it originally was. They did some tests on the digestibility, and it was pretty low digestibility with pretty poor crude protein, so on face value wouldn't appear to be a great feed source. And they also found that when they grazed it, it reduced the hectolitre weight from 74 to 50 grams per hectolitre. So that tells us that the sheep are grazing the dumps and picking out the good bits and leaving the light stuff behind. And so while on face value it looks like it's very poor feed, the sheep anecdotally did very well because they appeared to be picking out the good bits. And this will take a little bit of a minute to get your head around, but this is what Keith did. He looked at the following year, went back to those paddocks and had a look at the ryegrass germination around the dumps. And so he looked at the germination of ryegrass either 4 metres or 8 metres from the centre of the dump. And so he had a few treatments there, so you need to go through them slowly. There's ungrazed and burnt. So that's the normal practice where growers just dump the dumps and then burn them the following autumn. He also had grazed and burnt, and then also grazed and not burnt, which is what Andrew was doing. And as you can see, the ryegrass germination was the same for all of the different for all of the different treatments. So that's good news. Even though the sheep do spread the dumps out a little bit, it seems that a lot of ryegrass is perhaps rotting or going missing in some way, and that the sheep, even though they spread the dump out a bit, we weren't seeing a big ryegrass germination around the dumps. The other bit of information that they measured was that was the energy and the protein of the various feed types, and as you can see that as you would expect, the cereals, oats, barley, wheat having fairly low energy and fairly low protein, whereas canola and lupin having better energy and protein. However, many people involved in this work say that even though that on face value it appears to be poor feed quality, because the sheep pick out the good bits, they actually do very well on it. However, we have pretty limited data on the actual sheep production. Now, one last thing I would like to just question a little bit with this whole process is if we use the conveyor belt chaff delivery, which has become very common in the chaff carts, will it still be okay to graze and seed through the dumps? And Andrew might shed a little bit of light on this. The reason being is that when we use a conveyor belt chaff delivery into the chaff cart, we end up with quite a bit of the short straws in the dump, and so if we graze that, will those short straws be a problem to seed through? So that's just putting up a question. Talking to Andrew about it yesterday, he believed that if we were to do that, a lot of farmers have baffles in the back of their headers to minimise the amount of straw going in the dump, so that they end up with a little bit of straw but not too much. And so there are ways to set up the header so that we don't end up with too much straw, and that stops the ability to seed straight through those dumps. But that's just a question. A lot of the chaff carts out there look a little bit like this one, where we have the conveyor belt technology. It's great technology. However, will that cause a problem? And that's something that's more of a question than an answer for this webinar. Okay, I'm told that everything's going smoothly. There's 1 or 2 people stuck on a slide out there. Hopefully everyone else is going okay. If you're having a problem, perhaps put it in the questions box or in the chat box there and let us know, and we'll keep an eye on that and see if we can fix any problems as we go. And also put some questions down, add some questions to the box, and we'll keep an eye on the questions and cover them at the end. So now I would like to hand over to Andrew Boultbee. That's all from me for a minute. Andrew is going to tell us a little bit about how he's using the grazing of chaff dumps in his system, and I think I've handed over to you there, Andrew. You should be good to go. Yeah, Go for your lump.
Okay, all right. Well done, Peter. Hello, everyone. Yes, as Peter said, we're in the Avon Valley and wheat belt of Western Australia. Our farming operation is primarily on leased land. We do have our own farm, but 90% of our operation is on leased land. We've got 9 landlords all up. So some of those areas that we've gone on to have had pretty high weed numbers when we entered the leasing operation. Most of those leases are in excess of 8 to 10 years, some out to 20 years now. So we have had our chance to make an impact on those areas. When we went into these lease operations, obviously we had to, they were tenders and we had to compete with other people. So they're a 100% cropping operation with sheep grazing over summer. So we had to make 100% cropping work, which meant we weren't able to, because of the nature of the sheep industry, able to put sheep onto paddocks to grind weed numbers down. We had to do it with a full crop. So in all of that, we plant about 4,800 hectares a year, and that's spread over about 65 hectares. So there's a bit of travelling involved in that. But look, we're still here, and it all seems to be going. So we're doing a few things different to a few folk around, mainly to alleviate the problems we've been getting with seed collection. I guess. When we first went into it, we were primarily aiming at just reducing weed numbers. We weren't considering weed resistance or anything like that. So we've been collecting seed from the back of the header for about 12 years now. I would say we've probably been doing a good job for 5 or 6. The first few years, because of the lack of a rule book, and I guess going into it not having quite the right machinery or big enough machinery, and the ability to cut low and to get over it quickly, and reliable machinery and all those sorts of things, header heights, front cut heights came up, and timing wasn't the best, and also other systems that we'll talk about a bit later to try and trap the weeds weren't there. But over the last 5 or 6 years, we think we've been doing quite a reasonable job, and we're getting some quite decent results out of it. To have, I guess our aim out of all of this now is to have a rotation and a plant date uninhibited by weed pressure. So in saying that, we're trying to set up rotations and our plant dates that are, I guess, the most profitable we can do, rather than putting certain crops in just to control weeds. So if we can do that, we're able to utilise the whole growing season, and with a crop selected for profit, not really for weed control, primarily for weed control. If you do this in your budget, it can change your bottom line quite a bit, we find. So look, we're not totally there in some paddocks, but in most of our good paddocks, we're free to put in our rotation of our choice and our plant date, where, in dry sown early prior to the break of the season. So I'll move on to our first slide. Just catch my mouse. So this is you've seen this slide before. Look, it's just we run two headers with carts. This is just one of them, typical of one of them. Why we went into collection, I guess, and using a cart. Look, they're a very simple machine. They're quick to service. They're very reliable pieces of machinery. I have seen these in bog marks when the headers are turning around. I have seen these things completely airborne. They do land quite well and continue on through harvest. It's a fairly important point. in the fact that if you go down the path of spending all this money, we really do need to be able to grind a profit out of it at the end of the day. Reliability, look, they're very effective. They do catch the weeds, and I guess they're an affordable option at the time we went into it, and power requirements from a header are very low. It's the act of putting the front on the ground that chews up the horsepower. Having this thing on behind is just probably a very small power requirement. I think it's 25 to 30 horsepower will drive the blower, and that's about all you need. So there are some systems to make it easy for harvesting in steep country with time where we dump our heats. So look, the cart, we didn't particularly want to spread our weeds out in narrow windrow burning. We did that for a while. It wasn't good for stubble retention, so this was the choice. So look, I'll move on to the next slide, but just quickly before I do, I made up back to this one quickly. You can see by, especially around the back wheels of the cart, you can see our cut height there. That's pretty darn short. So anyway, we'll touch on that a bit later. So I'll move on to the next slide. This is look, just another chaff cart shot, really. That's about all that depicts. But what it is to me is we've got a header driver in there. It's probably some young Irishman or something, and he barely knows what he's just done. But for us, he's just dumped behind that header. He's just dumped all the waste nutrition that's coming off the sieve out of the back of that header in a pile, and he's also dumped the weeds exiting the header off the sieve all in one spot. It's pretty handy. Really, looking from behind there, he barely knows that thing is even there. Once he's been driving that a few weeks, he barely knows it's on. So that's the first thing we really see that. So after the act of lowering the front, the cart is virtually has no impact on our operation, on our speed of operation. It's the front sitting on the ground that slows us up. So I mean that involves any type of collection. In the years where we have a tight finish, so a dryish finish or a frost, and we've got some of those small grains that we've all seen before, the chaff heaps have a large amount of small seed or shrivel grain in it. We actually see barley heaps sometimes slumping in the centre, and that's because of the weight of the heap, the amount of barley in the heap. So it's a very good weed collector, but it's also a very good collector of protein. And in those tight years, it can be, if you've got a sheep operation, they can be a very handy tool to get those sheep through, and they can actually do better in a tight year than in a good year. So anyway, I prefer the good year, but that's good compensation in those tough years. So what we do after harvest, we late lamb and with merino ewes, and we will put them onto the canola heaps first, canola dumps first, and then on mating. So mating's later in January. We'll shift them onto our barley dumps. We find they do best on the barley dumps to mate, and then post mating we'll move them onto the wheat stubbles. The wheat stubbles have the least nutrition in them, usually because wheat's such an efficient little plant, has the least amount of small grain, I guess. So what that's done for us is it's brought our long-term merino lambing average well up over 100%. So that's in some cases we're going well over 100%, and it's enabled us to mate onto some great nutrition, and it's a great little. It's not that big, but it's a great cost recovery for some of the work we do with seed collection. Look, and pretty poor shot, but an important point on the back of the headers. Power casters, most headers are pretty good now. Modern headers are pretty good now, but to be able to, for stubble retention, to be able to spread the full width of the header front for us is very important. So we've got that on the back of our headers as well. So I'll just flick on to the next slide. Sorry, my mouse keeps running off the screen. So chaff dumps. These are just small dumps. So burning the heaps and getting rid of the residue has probably driven more people out of carts than people have gone into carts, I would have thought. There's been a lot of second-hand carts around the countryside for sale. Look, we were having to get over, like I said, 60 hectares, 60 kilometres of blocks and burn them. The job was an absolute nightmare. We had fires, getting away days later when a big wind came in. We'd get back from farms and the farmer would ring us up that we're on, and so the sea breezes in, smoke everywhere, and it was really hard work. We found that getting around the bottom side of your dumps, the downwind side of your dumps, with the fire units post lighting them up, was very dangerous, and we were sitting in thick smoke for weeks on end. Just wasn't a happening thing for me. We were tying up 3 utes and a truck. The utes were getting fairly hardly driven through all of this, and it was expensive and hard work. So what we were noticing, the odd errant heap that we didn't burn, we were seeding through, to our surprise, without any problems. The dumps here, Peter alluded to it a little earlier, only have the sieve fraction in there, so we've got a full separation between rotor and sieve material. So we're only collecting sieve material, and we want the least amount of heaps of the most concentrated sieve material in it. So we've got the least amount of our paddock covered up, I guess. So anyway, we'll talk about how we manage that, but a bit later. We don't want any rotor material in there. We figure we should be doing all of the separation job and getting it down onto the sieve. So we've got what we want in heaps. So what we noticed, as I was saying before, we noticed that we can seed through the odd left heap. So we decided to spread out the heaps across the workings in their lines across the paddock. So all we used for this was an old farm scarifier, and we ran up and back, up one way and then back the other, and smoothed it out in a line about 200 to 400 mils deep. It's a relatively cheap operation for us to do. We could put one of our new seeding staff on it with a whole bunch of maps, and it was a darn good orientator for him prior to seeding, to get out and spread these dumps. They do take a little bit of management to get the fellas doing it right, but once they get the hang of it, they're pretty right to chug away in their own time, and that's one of the easier operations that we have to do. It is critical at harvest time to get your alignment of your heaps. Really, when you go into a paddock for the first week or so, you need to get your drivers to think, where are they going to put their line, how many lines do they need. They'll get an indication of that on their first run, and how to put the lines in a good spot for a line, lining up and dealing with, so that when you're seeding, the dump lines are in the right spot. You don't have to have your cart chock-a-block full before you dump. It can be the site more important than how full it is. Yeah, that's a pretty important point. Sheep will do the job on the canola dumps. They will flatten those out absolutely fine. There's really not any great need to. I'll just move on to the next one. There's really no need to flatten these heaps out. The sheep will grind the canola down. They do very well. You'll stay on it for a long time. The canola will fall. The canola from the back of the header will fall straight to the bottom of the heap, and they will go graze to the bottom of that. There'll be a lot of sheep manure in that heap by the time they've finished it, and they don't require no more attention. The cereals though, the wheat and the barley, require spreading, and this is what the scarifier is used for. So we do need to do something with them. So that's the spreading bit we do there. The paddock, you can see here. I'll just show you this slide here. This paddock with this dump here, we know will have some brome grass in it. But yeah, even in this wet start this year, we know there's, well, we can see here that there's very little brome grass come out of it, managed to germinate out through the heap. So there's an unburnt canola stubble heap, and that's yeah, that's still okay, still acceptable. This one here is just showing, this is a barley crop, and it's still a canola heap. But it's just showing the DBS seeder that we use to go through these is just seeded through, so there's no burning, no flattening, just grazing, and it's presented no problems in crop. That's all that's showing. Where am I looking down here? Just bear with me a minute, folks. So in the past, in past 4 years that we've been doing this, we haven't noticed too many weed issues in any of the heaps at all. This year we had a very wet start, absolutely fantastic. So we have got some slightly less than desirable heaps. There are some areas that are a bit weedy for us. We've been thinking what we're going to do about this. It's mainly the barley heaps, and the fine nature of the barley heaps is causing quite a bit of thatching to happen, and that's causing a little problem because it stays dry for a little while, protects the seed rather than the composting effect. So what we're thinking is we may need to deal with some of these weeds. So I'm just trying to get to a slide here. Okay, so what we're thinking of doing here in this, I'll just move to, actually I'll go back, can I go back? Yeah. To here, is with our flattened heaps, we're thinking here that we are going to in-crop burn. So we've already done this in some small areas. I unfortunately don't have any photos to show you, but we're thinking in this situation we'll have a ute burner set up in crop to burn post-germination, probably around tillering time we've done it, with just 1 or 2 lines through each paddock. There'll be no fire breaks and no guarding of any fires breaking away. We estimate we'll be able to burn easily up to 1,000 hectares a day with one person. So what we have there, we'll just put a burner on and run down the line. So concentrating that line across the paddock is pretty important. So we've done small amounts of this in the past 2 years. If timed well, it's very effective. It's a slow, smouldering burn that's achieved. So slowing down, as you can see in this photo with the seeder coming through this unburnt heap, you can see the rear tines. There's about 4 rows there. The rear tines have seeded through and got some sort of germination. Not really critical, but it can help. So we do lift our machine slightly if the heaps are really thick, and that helps the trash flow. So right, moving on. This here is it's a wheat dump. It's 2 years old. And we're standing in the dump. That's where we got the material in my hands there from. And it's just showing the composting effect and the low weed in the crop and the crop competition, I guess. That's all it's trying to show. That's pretty much all barley there. There's no barley new crop. There's very few weeds in there. The material in my hand is pretty composted. I doubt if there's many surviving weed seeds in there. So that's completely unburnt. We haven't done anything to that heap. So I'll move on to this next one. That's where we were standing when we took the shot, and you can see under that arrow there, it's a dark green competitive crop, causing no problems. So once again, grazing. I think grazing is essential to add the sheep manure, to add the nitrate to the carbon to get the composting effect happening. Okay, so we'll move on here. This is a paddock out at Quairading, sort of, it's about 60 k's east of us from the Avon Valley, and this is one that we farm. It's a Google shot. It's 53 hectare block. It's 3 years of unburnt stubble, and the dumps at Quairading may be able to see by the marks. If you look at the 2-year-old unburnt heaps with the arrow there, you can see a lateral line. I hope you can see that going up and down. That's the scarifier marks with the little green vigorous crop dots up through it. So they're 2 years. Obviously you can see last year's. It's a pretty late Google shot. And then you can see the 3-year-old dumps. Now this paddock's on a highway. We can walk down through it regularly, and it had quite high numbers when we got there, but it's pretty darn good now. So look, it's a good shot of not burning at all, working quite well in the wheat belt. The interesting thing is, if we're concerned about in-crop burning, I measured out the harvest chaff heaps of last year, so the lighter coloured ones on the long arrow, and they amount to about 0.35 of a hectare in a 53 hectare paddock. Now that's if you took the whole lot out. There are some gaps there, and we grow some crop through the heaps, so it wouldn't even be that. So it's negligible. Right. Okay, into 12 kilometres an hour. So look, I think the beer can is talked about as a good cut height. I suggest cut height should be below the top of the can, and this is shown in the first slide that we looked at with that chaff cart sitting in the paddock. That what we have with that cut height is we must keep reminding ourselves that we're selecting for plants that like to lodge and plants that like to shed. So if we've got lodges, then the lower we get, the better. So yes, I suggest the old beer can is a good thing, but you really should aim at cutting it off at about the Victoria sign. So one thing in considering your header size when you do that, and your header speed. So your big header may not be able to do 12 kilometres. It's pretty scary to do that at 12 kilometres an hour. You may end up delaying your harvest because you've got damaged fronts. Okay, so I guess all that, the collection, carts are one thing, but having a system and a harvest plan with very clean paddocks is where the focus must be. Getting the tricky buggers up the header front prior to shedding or lodging requires a good plan and a good system to be able to get them before this happens, because they get better and better at it as your collection years go on. We use 30% barley in our rotation, sometimes fertilising it at higher rates than we would really prefer. So this is a crop typical of that. It's probably got a little bit higher nitrate requirement on it than we'd like. In a lucky year like this, we get away with it, but it's all about keeping that guy from lodging, that ryegrass plant. I hope you can see that ryegrass plant there from lodging. So competitive crops to help stop any lodging. It's only on 30% of our program where we'll fertilise like this, but it's in that barley phase. Now this barley crop is going to be swathed to reduce the number of escapees that can possibly lodge. In some cases we'll harvest standing cereals, as in wheat, or if there's other barley, prior to trap any weeds that are at risk of lodging or shedding if they're standing, and then we'll return to the barley a little later to get that, because we've got all these weeds in the swath, and if there's any radish there as well, we'll have that as well, and it'll be dry and crunchy by the time we come to harvest it, not a green radish plant. So there's plenty of talk that we still get that when it's green, but if it's dry, I'm sure we get the radish a whole lot better. Okay, so that's one of our operations. There is the swath barley. It's one of our, I guess, a bit of our system that we use to get the standing crops first, so that it buys us some time, so to speak. So we've got canola and then the swath barley. They're all early, and then we can go and get wheat before we come back. So we do that in some situations. So when we're selecting our varieties to do all of this, we're looking for yield, but we're looking for competitiveness in the crop, and we're also looking for very hard grain. So when we're going through those MVT trials, we need hard grain and we need competitiveness. So when we're looking through MVT trials, we'll be looking at about this time of year when they're say got only a flag leaf left, and we'll be looking for shadow in between the interrow to see how much that interrow has still got shadow on it. And it's amazing when you walk through those MVT sites, the different, some interrows are almost full sun and some almost 80% shadow. So we're looking for those ones, and we need very hard grain. So the harvesting of this, we need to be objective with what we're trying to do. We're all good at getting the grain in the tank, but we need to go through in mind with the object of having tight concaves and the highest possible rotor speed, knowing that you've got a good solid grain in there that can take a bit of a beating, because one, you've suddenly got a header that you used to have so much material going through. You've now put your front flat on the ground. Your rotor is full of material, and so you need that rotor speed to wind out to separate and tight concave to separate as early as you can in your header, up the front of the header, so that those weed seeds have got a much chance of falling down onto that sieve rather than being wound out the rotor. So you don't want to go down all of this path and then just fail at the harvest operation by flicking seeds out through your rotor and out through into your chopper and back onto the paddock. So you really do want them. And I'd strongly advise that if you had a weedy paddock, of going in late at night when it was moist, or first paddocks after a rain when it was still quite wet. So yes, you need to have that conscious in your mind all the time. If you've got drivers in there, you need to know their rotor speeds, you need to know their concave settings, and you need to be able to probably be a little tolerant of some cracked grain. So yeah, that's just that one. Now what we've got here is the barley varieties, and I guess that's really all what I was trying to say then. So now that the rock picking, are we here? Yeah, the rock picking. Look, at something in the areas that we farm is very important. We've actually have to have a machine here, and then we rock pick for 6 weeks post seeding. And that's a guy on a machine, and then there are guys in paddocks as well. We try and do some through harvest, but it's one of the most important things, because you don't want to roll up at your bank manager with a late harvest and storm damaged crop, and just because you stumped your front or something like that through poor paddock preparation. So that's a pretty important part of our operation. Sorry about that, just to deal with the phone. Anyway, it's all good. All right. Okay, so in summation, where are we after 12 years of this? Like I said, we've probably been doing a great job for 6 years, 5 or 6 years, and doing a lot of learning in the first 6 years. So hence what we're trying to do now, so that people can do the good job to start with. So paddocks with very high rye numbers that we went into were hard work and required every tool possible that you can possibly use, as well as collection. Once on top of the paddocks of the weeds, the clean paddocks really just either stay good or get better. Swathing works really well, although you are cutting off your income and laying it on the ground. It's a bit of a concern. There are tricks to swathing, and you really do need to do your homework on swathing. There are a certain bunch of tricks, and you don't want to get them wrong, because it's a bit spooky just chopping all your grain and throwing it on the ground. So yeah, you've got to be very careful doing that, but it's a very powerful tool, we've found. You will have to slow your header down, so make sure that you've got the capacity for this. So we've had to go down the 2-header path for our operation. You are able to carry more sheep over summer and do them better, especially in a poor year. So that's just a fantastic little bit of, and probably is a small amount of cost recovery for this operation, but it's a great thing. One thing with non-burning that you have to watch out for volunteers. If there's something that's going to survive, it's probably your barley seed or something like that. That can be a bit tricky. So look, what that we've done different really is swathing and non-burning of heaps, and what we're aiming at now is getting into winter burning on some of those troublesome areas. That's been a great saviour for us, because we really were wondering about how we continue with our health and with burning and everything, and the stopping of burning has just been a fantastic thing for us. So I don't think we'll ever go back to that, and the winter burning will be a whole different deal. So that's I think that's about me. I guess yeah, no, that's about me. All I stress in this whole thing is it's costly. You must make it work, because you do need to derive profit from it. And know when you're harvesting that you're selecting for lodgers and shedders. So you've got to interrupt that plant in that, and how you do it is mostly timing or competitiveness or swathing or something like that. So yeah, that's about me. There's probably lots I've missed, but that's where I'm at.
That's excellent. Thanks, Andrew. Fantastic. I might get you to hand back the controls to me, but yeah, it's Peter Newman back here again. You've done a huge job there, Andrew, and everyone's still listening in. So you've managed to maintain the audience, which is quite an achievement. It does feel a bit funny delivering a webinar when you're sitting in front of your computer chatting away, wondering if anyone's listening, and everyone is listening in, so it's great. Now, we've only got a bit over 10 minutes to get through a lot of questions, so Andrew, between you and I, we might charge through these questions and just pick a few of them, and I think you've answered a few along the way. So let's go through them. We'll give nice short answers, and then we'll wrap this up in 10 minutes. So the first one is there planned research to look at animal performance to support the farmers' observations? I'm not aware of any specifically, and that might be a good question to animal researchers, and perhaps if anyone out there knows of any of this research, you could put a comment in the chat box now, but I'll leave that one. Swathing barley, you've already answered, Andrew. Yes, you do catch more weeds with swathing barley. Can you spray anything on the heaps to make it more palatable and digestible? I'm no animal nutritionist, but from what I can gather, the sheep are very good at picking up the palatable and digestible bits. And while it may be possible to spray something on there to make it more palatable, I think, Andrew, your observations are that they probably do just fine the way it is. Any comments there?
Look, exactly, Peter. That once they get used to it, by about year 2 or 3, they're pretty darn good. You know what the sheep are like. They'll find it, and we find towards towards the end of it, we've got that scarifier coming through and putting them into lines. They'll get a bit more then, but no, well, personally, I wouldn't bother with that. Damn good opportunity in some of those tighter years where they're a bit fuller to set up a lot feeding operation. I'm just too busy for that. Well, too disorganised for that, I suppose. But
no, well, everyone's busy. Grazing in situ makes it easy, doesn't it? So that's what it's
there
all
are
about.
people doing cattle lot feeds off. I know quite a big lot feed that just use chaff heaps and add to it. And their protein levels are sort of halfway there. It's quite a good exercise. I haven't been able to organise that. That was the initial intent, but it hasn't happened.
And the other option there is some growers that are using the conveyor belt chaff cart with straw in them are driving a baler straight through the heaps and baling up the heaps and then using those in feedlot situations. Can you graze narrow windrows? Well, you can, and people are grazing narrow windrows, but you can't overgraze them because essentially the sheep put too many fire breaks in the windrow and it just makes them very, very hard to burn. And also it spreads them out wider, which can reduce that burning temperature. There are many people doing it. A light graze of narrow windrows can be very good. We find the stock eat a lot of the leaf off the cereal plants, which reduces the risk of spread, but a heavy graze is not a great idea. The next question, will a 9650 pull a 20 cubic metre TrueFab cart with a conveyor setup? I know from my experience that I'm yet to find a harvester that won't pull a 20 cubic metre cart. They're really quite light and they only carry a few tonnes of chaff when they're completely full, so the weight is not an issue. The issues I have heard of is where with the very modern headers, sometimes they attaching the hydraulic system to run the conveyor belt can throw out the electronics and upset the header. But Andrew, I would guess you would say that there'd be no problem towing a chaff cart with a 9650?
No, not at all. We've got some very steep country, like incredibly steep country in the Avon Valley, and we just time where our dumps are so that when we're climbing the hill, we're empty. The machine is empty. The cart is empty. So sometimes in those paddocks we might have 2 or 3 heap lines rather than 1, but we just dump prior to going down the hill and dump prior to going up the hill. But no, they're fine. That would be absolutely fine. I wouldn't personally. I'm a bit wary of 20 cubic metres, especially for this business of driving over them with a scarifier. If you're going to spread your heaps, it's a huge dump. So it's not the size of the heap. We've got the line going across the paddock anyway. With this 20 cubic metre thing, it means you've got lots of, you might have a run and a half in between each dump heap. So you may have to develop your special piece of machinery to spread them out rather than a scarifier.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that one. Now the next question from Maury, what about urine and manure fouling heaps during the grazing phase? I know, Andrew, you had one experience where you had a truckload of wheat or grain knocked back because it had sheep manure in it, where someone had harvested and picked up a bit of the old heap. Is that right? And you've got to harvest over the top of the old heaps?
Absolutely. Look, yes, you've got to be very, because you really do want to be able to collect off that heap again as well if there's any survivors in it. But you've just got to be so onto your drivers. They've got to keep that front above the heap, because for sure it will have manure in it, and for sure that manure will end up in your grain tank. So, look, if that's what he meant, also I'm wondering whether he meant when you're grazing it, urine and manure in the heaps, no problems, especially for worms, because it's summer. They can't go through their cycle in the heap, so they won't get worms out of the heap, or no, they just go and get the grain. I don't think they mind if there's a bit of urine on it.
Yeah.
So okay. I don't know what he meant out of that, but could have been one or the other. But yes, in a harvest situation, harvesting over top of the heap, you don't pick it up, you'll be in trouble.
There's another one from Maury, and he said that he's guessing that Lance Turner's style of chaff cart with a conveyor belt with some stubble in the piles is not as good as the older style when sowing through them. And we did touch on that briefly, and I know that the Messinas up this way have a conveyor belt chaff cart, and they added a baffle plate that Andrew talked about to make sure the straw goes out in the chopper and the just the chaff goes in the cart, and they halved the number of chaff cart piles by doing so. So there are header modifications that you can do to minimise the amount of straw in the dumps. They still have some straw in their dumps, so they burn quickly, but they don't have too much. Okay, now just last couple of questions. Do you still suck feed your weaners?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes, we do. Yes, for sure. Yeah. No, the weaners are lick feeder savvy, so to speak, prior to weaning, and we do. Yep. But they still do tremendously well off the heaps, but they've got lick feeders out there. They're merinos. Don't give many excuses.
Andrew Story would like to know what your neighbours will think of your winter burning.
They probably hate us.
I guess it's probably pretty similar to summer burning, though. They'll probably hate you then as well.
But like most wheat belt, you don't have too many neighbours. So look, in a small tight community, it might be a problem. For my mind, it's an agricultural area. We're just doing, that's what we've got to go down that path. So look, there are smouldering heaps. Yes.
Okay, Andrew, a couple more. Another one from Maury. If you get a lot of rain on the chaff piles in summer and they start to compost, do you get less feed value from them?
In general, they don't compost in summer. It's not a lot of rain. That's not a lot of rain. The odd storm, especially when they're untouched, prior to grazing, they're a dome shape, so they're waterproof.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's only once grazing they lose their water. They lose their water shedding ability. So no, that in summer when they're untouched, they're completely waterproof.
And one or two more. This one could take you half an hour, but maybe if we go for it, we've got only a couple of minutes left before the webinar will end. But what are the tricks to swathing barley?
Oh, okay, I'll be quick as I can. Cut it as low as possible, because the higher you cut it, you're cutting your pickup material in half. So cut it as low as possible. Don't try and set it up on stubble. It won't stay there anyway. So plus 2 tonne to the hectare crop. You don't want to be too thin. You need quite a high belt speed. You need to be very gentle with your reel. It needs to be completely straw coloured, no green. Otherwise, you'll have small grain. So you need quite an even crop. You need even ripening crop. You need to keep your make your swath quite tight. So where you've got those baffles for making your swath tight or wide, it needs to be very tight. Make sure on some of these 40-foot swathers that it's not lumpy. You'll have to walk on the top of it and see if it's lumpy. Don't do too much to start with. You will learn lots in your first year of swathing. Yeah, how the swath is laid is absolutely critical, and cut it as short as possible and no green.
Okay, thanks, Andrew.